Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. always a pleasure to follow on from my former MP, Mr. Smith. I have to berate him somewhat, Mr. Chair. As a winemaker, as a fellow winemaker, Mr. Smith, honestly, you can have low alcohol or you can have wine. I do want to touch on some of the comments of Ms. Upston, Mr. Chair, one of my two favourite ministers, even though she did use her call as an opportunity to apply some spin to the statistics and continue the myth that foreigners are not coming in droves and buying our farmland out from under us, hand over fist. Mr. Chair, investment is one thing, ownership is another, and simply changing ownership from a New Zealand owner to a foreign owner, it doesn't actually count as investment, particularly when there's nothing stopping the money that changes hands disappearing off to the Gold Coast, as I imagine quite a few of them do. Mr. Chair, it did raise an interesting point, because it sort of segued into what Eugenie Sage was saying about the changing face of the landscape, and obviously some of that new money, I'll call it, it's not investment, going into converting land use types. And of course, the tussock in the Mackenzie country is not a natural landscape for that area. 2,000 years ago, it was all totara forest, and now, of course, nature is trying to turn it back into pine forest, as you see with wilding pines, which, of course, the government is putting money into trying to eradicate in this budget. So that in itself is to do connects with irrigation, Mr. Chair, and New Zealand First is actually fully supportive of the government's stated intention of putting more money into irrigation start-up schemes. The difficulty with that, as I'm sure my colleague Dennis O'Rourke would attest, is not the schemes themselves, but actually the difficulty in obtaining money from them for some of these schemes. And in actual fact, the amount of capital that's needed by irrigation schemes for start-up is minuscule in relation to the total cost of those schemes. What's really needed is a little kickstart to get the schemes over the line, because when that happens, most of the money that goes into them is private equity from farmers, as I'm not sure is not well understood, certainly on perhaps other parts of this side of the House, never mind the wider public. Mr. Chair, I didn't really want to dwell on those. The Chair of the committee talked about biosecurity, and obviously Mr. O'Connor spoke on that as well. And we've heard many times that it is the single most important priority of the Minister. Ian McKelvey, in his contribution, said that it's very important that we keep up the amount of money, the amount of expenditure going into biosecurity, which is what's staggering to me, Mr. Chair, that when you look at the expenses, revenue and capital expenditure for biosecurity under Vote Primary Industries, revenue from the Crown for biosecurity has dropped by $16 million, and revenue for border biosecurity monitoring and clearance is down by another $18 million. Now, I know that the government talks about the biosecurity passenger levy. That's going to take some time to ramp up, and even when it does, it's only going to be a replacement stream of revenue for that service, not an increase in revenue for that service. So whereas it could be argued at an ideological level, there's nothing wrong with passengers coming in paying for their own biosecurity clearance, it is not actually additional investment by the nation in the vital activity of border biosecurity. We know that we're not inspecting cargo that comes into this country anywhere near the rate we should be. 1 in 4 containers at best gets inspected. There needs to be more money spent on that. We know that we are not succeeding with a biosecurity strategy because we have threats coming through. We know that the Green Lane, for example, even if it worked up to the 98.5% that was the government's target, would still have let in 135,000 things that shouldn't have got through the border in the last 4 years alone. There's nothing that's going to work other than a return to 100% screening, Mr. Chair, and that is going to take more money. And I'm afraid I almost despair of raising the question of biosecurity with this government, because they've come to the point where they believe their own propaganda. And what it is going to take, I think, is the next 18 months, Mr. Chair, and a change to a New Zealand First government, and the next government will be a New Zealand First government in one shape, form or another, and Mr. Barclay can chortle, but he's going to be looking for another job after the end of next year. So it will be a New Zealand First government in one shape, form or another, and we will deal with this then, Mr. Chair. I also wanted to touch on forestry, because again, Mr. McKelvey mentioned that log prices were as good as they have been for a long time. Actually, revenue from the sale of forest products from Crown Forest is down by about $12 million, Mr. Chair, and there's two things about that. Well, I mean, I guess the government will say, well, you know, we've reduced the size of forest. Maybe they have. But what on earth is the government doing selling logs anyway? Surely the whole thrust of New Zealand Inc. is that we should be selling value-added products, not simply logs. But what I really wanted to, Mr Chair,
Richard Prosser.
what I really wanted to concentrate on, Mr Chair, was the anachronism that is the lack of investment that this government, or the lack of importance this government seems to afford to agriculture and fisheries. We know that aquaculture is the way of the future in terms of feeding the planet. As the world's population increases, as the amount of available land decreases, as pressure to produce protein increases, we're looking increasingly to the sea. And in fact, last year, globally, the tonnage of farmed ocean fish harvested exceeded the tonnage of wild-caught ocean fish harvested for the first time. So we know that not just here in New Zealand, but all around the world, ocean farming is becoming more and more important. And yet the amount of money that, under Sustainable Economic Development and Trade, departmental output expenses again, that the government is putting into aquaculture has dropped by $500,000. Under fisheries management, which we're told is again of vital importance, that's dropped management itself by at least $200,000, and fisheries enforcement and monitoring by nearly the same margin. Mr Chair, there's a divergence between the government's rhetoric and what it's actually putting on paper, what it's actually putting in the bank to make these things happen. Aquaculture is the way forward for New Zealand in the future. New Zealand needs to be right at the cutting edge of this industry, the development of it, support for it in all its aspects, be that finfish farming, shellfish farming, mussels, oysters. Salmon farming, of course, is the great El Dorado on the horizon. The market for farmed salmon around the world is about 2.4 million tonnes. Norway currently produces around about half that. There's a potential for New Zealand who has, we have a unique species in this country, Chinook salmon. Nobody else apart from one small company in Canada is farming it. We're doing it better than anybody else. There's a potential for us to supply about half the premium in that 2.5 million tonnes, Mr Chair. There's the potential for this country to have a $2.5 billion salmon farming industry, and the government is simply not putting any real effort, priority or money into that. So that is something that, another failure on their part, yet another thing that we will have to correct once we are the government. Thank you, Mr Chair.
I call